Story 1. I had this happen and I let her in. She was about my age. She had pictures of the house when it was being built. She knew a lot about the house. We've stayed in touch. She sends me old pictures when she finds them, and I send her pictures of the renovations I've done. It's all good. Story 2. This happened to me. I spent 20 minutes talking to him. I invited him around back to show him the garden and gave him a zucchini. Story 3. I don't deal well with strangers, so I probably wouldn't even answer the door in the first place unless I was expecting someone. Story 4. I would close it, as I am the first and only owner of my house. However, a few months ago, I was back in the town where I grew up. I decided to visit my old house. It looked different from the outside. The yard was better maintained, and there was a new fence around the pool. As I walked up the driveway, a man came out to ask if he could help me. I said, "It's a strange story, but I grew up in this house and left in 1981. We started talking, and his wife came outside to see what was going on. They ended up giving me a tour of the house and showed me some changes on the inside. They told me they had to remove an old, rickety tree fort in the backyard. I mentioned that I built it and that it was rickety even then. It was strange seeing it, especially since all the surrounding yards were now fenced, which wasn't the case when I grew up." Story 5. I might have a chat with them for 5 minutes if I believed them and didn't get negative vibes from them. I have seen people do this before. It's just a tactic used to deceive others. Story 6. I'm not sure I would answer the door if a group of strangers showed up. If I did, they would have to answer specific questions about the house before I let them in. Story 7. It would depend on their demeanor. My mother and brother visited our former home in Los Angeles some time ago. I wish I had been there too. The Mexican woman who lived there not only let them in to revisit the place but also gave them pieces of her homemade pineapple cake. Story 8. Tell them they are mistaken because the house is new and I am the first resident. So please leave. Story 9. My dad is hopelessly sentimental. We drove past a house where his grandparents lived. The owners were doing yard work, so we stopped to chat. We didn't ask to see inside, and perhaps his being almost 80 years old and having 2 daughters with him didn't raise any concerns. Story 10. I couldn't. I understand that people want to visit. There is an old childhood home I would like to see too, but I cannot do that. It is not my home anymore, and it would be awkward for everyone. However, you cannot be sure that the person is telling the truth, and they could be there to do something terrible. Story 11. Well, this is funny timing. My wife was dropping off our child in the next city and ended up on the same street where I grew up. She passed by my old house and took a picture, and the owner came out. My wife quickly got out of the car to explain the situation. They had a good conversation and extended an invitation for me to visit my old home. Story 12. As someone who is passionate about genealogy and aware of the houses my family has lived in over the last century, I would want to share this information but would remain skeptical. Story 13. I wouldn't slam the door in their face. That sounds rude. There's no reason to be unkind to them. However, I will not invite them in. Story 14. I would let them in. I am very sentimental and would love someone to do the same for me. Additionally, I am quite familiar with the history of my house and know the last names of a few previous families, so I could vet them a little. Story 15. I once walked up to the house where I used to live. I knocked on the door and asked the elderly couple if I could come in. My parents said no. Story 16. I go into stealth mode when someone knocks on my door. They wouldn't even get to speak to me. Story 17. It happened to me. I was in the garden when a man parked in front of the house and looked at it for a few minutes. I approached him, and he shared stories about growing up here with his parents and 2 siblings. I gave him a tour, and we had a long conversation about the area and its history. He was great. Story 18. No, I would not invite them into my house. These people are strangers to me. They can use Google Maps to view the house from the outside, possibly from the back. They can check Zillow to see if the house was ever listed for sale and likely view pictures. There is no need for them to knock on my door. Story 19. It's not going to make you feel better. You can't go back and it belongs to someone else now. When my parents sold my childhood home, I saved a lot of pictures of it as I remember. I look at those when feeling nostalgic, but I've never gone back to visit and don't wish to. Consider looking at family photos instead and seeing the place as it was when it was yours. Story 20. I live in a house that is 162 years old. It is currently a 9-room bed and breakfast. About a month ago, a woman rang my doorbell and told me her mother was born in this house in the 1930s. I invited her in, showed her the house, and she shared some old photos with me. It was delightful, and I'm happy I didn't turn her away. Story 21. The girl who grew up in my house bought the house across the street. Every day, she looks out her front door and can see her childhood home. I think it is sweet. She has been in my house exactly once, and she is a good neighbor. Story 22. When my ex and I bought our house, we conducted extensive research on the previous owners. We discovered a man whose parents owned the house for 50 years, and he grew up there. He shared photos of the house from the 1940s with us, which was incredible. We passed the photos and stories on to the new owners, who were thrilled to learn all this history. Story 23. It is too dangerous these days. Photos of the home are online from previous listings, so you cannot even trust what they remember about the place. Story 24. We haven't answered our door unannounced more than a few times in 30 years, just like the phone. Story 25. I don't trust strangers nowadays, so I will just monitor my cameras until they leave. If I'm not expecting someone, then I won't answer the door. Story 26. I had a similar experience in the house my husband and I currently live in. First, I met the youngest son who drove by with his wife. It was an unfortunate situation where he was promised the home, but there was no will when his father died, and the stepmother sold it without his consent. He asked about all the changes we had made and was grateful that we treated the house with love. He shared many stories about growing up there. Sometime later, the stepbrother came by to retrieve mail, as the stepmother was elderly and did not know how to forward it. He was pleasant and surprised at how much the house had changed. A few months later, the stepbrother drove by with the stepmother in the car, and I saw them while walking our dogs. We talked for quite a while. She expressed deep regret about selling the home, as she did it while overwhelmed with grief from her husband's passing. When I told her everything we had done and reassured her that the house was filled with love, she seemed happy. Occasionally, I see her and her son drive by. We have been in our home for just shy of 3 years. Story 27. I recently had an interesting experience. 3 kids showed up at my door, with one of them believing he had grown up there. These children were no more than 13 or 14 years old, and my house is about 14 or 15 years old. My response was simply, "Oh, really?" When I didn't invite them in or ask any more questions, they were unsure of what to say next and eventually left awkwardly. Story 28. The ranch I run was formerly owned by 2 brothers who were born there. When I took over management of the place, this would happen occasionally with their extended family. I invited them in and let them walk around. Their family has stewarded this land for generations. It belongs to them still, just as much as it does to the current owners. Who am I to turn away someone who grew up in the house I live in or helped build the barn where I keep the horses? I know all of them, and they still have a standing invitation to drop by any time they like. Story 29. I lost my parents when I was young and found my way back to the house they had built. The couple living there had purchased the house and knew about us. They had been there for more than 2 decades, raised children in the house, and were now retired. They invited me in and allowed me to look around. In the end, I was able to get pictures of the walkway my father had built. It still had our last name's initial in brickwork in the concrete, along with my sister's and my own footprints stamped in the concrete. I also took some distant shots of the house, but nothing from inside. It was very kind of them. Story 30. Why would I let random people into my house? Who's to say one of them isn't a government official with a personal issue against me for some reason? Story 31. My family and I visited our first home, which we moved out of in 1995, about 20 years later in 2015. The new owner kindly let us inside to see the nearly $750,000 worth of renovations. It turned out that the house and the renovations were a wedding gift from her father, who is a Disney executive, possibly their chief technology officer. Story 32. That was a bit like me. I was biking by the house I grew up in when I slowed down to look, and the person in the front yard greeted me. We started talking. They had just moved in and thought I was a neighbor. I'm not. I just take really long bike rides. I gave them a 3-hour tour of the house, covering the sketchy electrical system, plumbing issues, where cables were buried in the yard, tips on shoveling the roof to prevent ice dams, and the cracks in the ceiling that kept reappearing even after being plastered. I also pointed out the 3 areas in the foundation that we repaired with wood instead of concrete. They knew it was a fixer-upper, but they were really happy to get the details. Story 33. I experienced a similar situation at our old house with the daughter of the man from whom we purchased it and her partner. I welcomed them in and gave them a tour. She was emotional when she saw that we were restoring the house, and her partner had done the roofing, so it was nice having her there to share details about when they resheathed everything. I showed the daughter some closets that had a lot of writing, which I assume belonged to her and her siblings. We took pictures to preserve it. I truly enjoyed meeting them and hearing her memories. Story 34. That would make them my niece, so I would let her in. If it is not her, then they are a liar and can go away. Story 35. I stepped out to the front porch and talked to them. My house has a history, so this was possible. If I liked them and they could provide enough information to convince me they were who they claimed to be, I might invite them back the next day for a tour. The following day, I would have many people with me, of course. Story 36. I would if they seemed honest. I was actually in your position once. I felt nostalgic and went by my childhood house. I parked outside for a bit, and the homeowner noticed me when she stepped outside. I didn't want to seem weird or creepy, so I got out and introduced myself from a distance. She invited me in, and I looked around a bit from the entry. She was very kind and asked if I wanted to see the upstairs. She was managing 2 toddlers, and I didn't want to impose, so I declined. It was a great experience. I am glad to see more children growing up there. Story 37. I wondered about this but didn't ring the doorbell. My dad installed the sidewalk in the backyard, and as a child, I accidentally left a footprint in it. I wanted to see if it was still there. Story 38. I don't need to invite them in, nor do I want to be rude. I would ask them if they could return another day, obtain their contact information, verify their identity, and possibly invite them back on a day that suits me. Story 39. This happened several times in the house where I grew up. My parents allowed visitors in, and they walked around the house, sharing stories about events that occurred when they lived there. It was quite fascinating to hear the history of the house. Story 40. I wouldn't let them in because these days you can't really trust people. I also have a dog who does not do well with strangers, so it would be unnecessary stress. Story 41. No, childhood home or not, it's not their home anymore, and there is no reason to entertain them, let alone explain any of the changes I have made. There is no benefit other than the remote possibility that it provides some positive nostalgia for them. Story 42. Why would I invite total strangers into my house? My house was built in 2011, so I wouldn't believe them anyway. Story 43. I experienced this when I moved to an apartment a few years ago. The previous tenant wanted to view the space one last time a few months after I had settled in. I refused. There's no reason to view an apartment you rented after moving out. That's just bizarre. Additionally, she caught me in the middle of a deep clean. It was late afternoon, and I was unshowered, sweaty, and in the most worn clothes I had. What's even stranger is that she returns periodically to walk around the complex. I never speak to her. The fact that she comes back raises more red flags for me, and I am suspicious of her attachment to my home and the complex in general. Story 44. Hank Hill would like to offer some advice, especially if they visit during the Christmas holidays. Story 45. I don't trust anyone these days. If I could know for certain that they were telling the truth and my house was in order, then maybe I could. But aside from that, no. You never know the true nature and intentions of people. Story 46. 20 years ago, My extended family tried to do something unusual. We were having a family gathering, and afterward, someone suggested we stop by my mother's childhood home to check it out. I thought it was strange, and besides, I had grown up hearing stories about the house. That was enough for me, but they insisted. When we arrived, the homeowner answered and, seeing all of us, around 20 people, told us to leave his property or he would call the police. My uncle tried to reason with him, and honestly, he was lucky he didn't get shot. We ultimately left, and my uncle and aunts kept discussing how rude the homeowner was. This baffles me, as I'm sure if the roles were reversed, they would have acted the same or worse. However, that was not the first or last time I wished I wasn't related to those characters. I still believe that it's strange to do such things. I don't live in a house, but even if I did, I would not allow a previous homeowner to enter and view it. Even if they owned the house at some point, they could still use information gained from going through it to cause me harm. I'm not taking that chance. Story 47. An elderly man once came to our home and said that he used to live there and wanted to go inside to have a look. However, we knew who built the house. It was our family, and it is 100 years old. No one outside our family has ever lived here. I still wonder what his intentions were or if he somehow got the wrong house. Story 48. I don't answer the door to an unknown knock. If I am not expecting someone, then I am not answering for anyone. Story 49. I wouldn't answer the door at all for a stranger. However, even if I did, I would know they were lying because I know who has been in my house before me. Story 50. Well, I have a very territorial Rottweiler, so if they are still at the door by the time I get there, I will be somewhat surprised. I definitely wouldn't let them in. Before anyone says anything, my Rottweiler is just a big barker. He wouldn't actually attack anyone. Story 51. I wouldn't trust the words of someone if doing so meant they were about to walk into my house. That's a ridiculous risk. Story 52. I wanted to drive by my old house where I grew up to see how it looks from the outside. I didn't have time in the end, but I wouldn't want to knock on the door and say, "Hi, you don't know me? But I used to live here." And I just wanted to say that and maybe take a look. To ensure I was right, I could mention the drawing in the attic and the letters carved in the wall. They would definitely believe me, but it feels rude. Story 53. It depends on the vibe I'm getting. If it's women, I'm less likely to be suspicious. That doesn't mean they aren't capable of robbing me, of course. Story 54. I'd be kind, but no, they wouldn't be invited in. I don't invite strangers into my home. In fact, I rarely even answer the door. Story 55. I wouldn't answer in the first place because I don't answer the door unless I know or am expecting the person. However, anyone who claimed to have grown up in my house would be mistaken because the only people who can truthfully say that are my brother and me. Story 56. I would ask their name because I know the names of the only people who owned this house before me since 1955. I would also mention that I still receive mail for their deceased parent on occasion, and they should probably address that with the post office. Story 57. This sounds like my mom in a way. About 10 years ago, we were driving around the rural areas where I live and came across a house she thought was gorgeous. We live in a safe place. The owner let my mom inside and gave her a complete tour, and she still thinks fondly of it to this day. Story 58. I shut the door. In my defense, the person we bought our house from had lived there since the 1960s, and her son was involved in illegal activities before she passed away. Once the bank took over and he was removed, the problems in the area diminished. With our new neighbors from the police department, we are now crime-free. Story 59. I would say, "Nice to meet you. Thank you for stopping by." I would not slam the door in their face, but I definitely would not invite them in. Story 60. My dad tried to do this with me in our old house. They said, "Oh, isn't that nice? Have a nice day." Then they locked the door. The woman who lived there actually worked for my mom at the time, and my mom was very puzzled when she heard that my dad did that. Personally, I would never do this as an adult. Story 61. I wouldn't slam the door in their face, but I would say, "That's cool. I don't know you and you could be lying, so no. Goodbye." Story 62. I would have never opened the door. Unless it is a package I ordered or a friend I invited over, I am not answering. Story 63. This happened to my family at our old house. My dad just said, "That's nice," and shut the door on them. Story 64. No one comes through that front door. Everyone who knows me has my number and knows to text or call first. So no, I wouldn't do either. Story 65. They didn't ask, so I have no reason to consider letting them in. I wouldn't slam the door in their face, but I would ask them what they wanted. If they asked to come in, I would say no. Story 66. Most likely, I wouldn't even answer the door. My doorbell rings and I never go to answer it. However, if I did answer it, I would try to vet them before telling them to leave. Story 67. Someone showed up at my mother's house, probably 20 years ago. It was just one middle-aged man who said he grew up in the house and wanted to see it again. My mother let him in, and he shared some history of the house, mentioning that the family room had a unique brick floor. He explained that the bricks came from a historical part of the city. When they pulled up an old brick street, his parents used those bricks for the floor. It was interesting to learn that. These days, I probably wouldn't let anyone in, though I might be foolish and open the door. Story 68. I once revisited my childhood home after a couple of decades. I just looked at it for a while from the street. I thought it would be rude to approach someone by knocking on their door unannounced, and it would be presumptuous to expect that they would invite a stranger inside. Story 69. I cannot let them in. My brother is diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and I must be careful not to provoke him. He is lucid now, but that is due to my vigilance. I do feel sad about the situation. Story 70. I was fortunate years ago when I returned to New Orleans to see the house we once owned. We planned to take a few photos of the front to share with the rest of the family, as we were the original owners. As soon as we arrived, the tenants came home. When we explained who we were, she kindly invited us in and welcomed us to take photos. It was a pleasant and unexpected gesture. I would be hesitant to allow someone inside, but I would permit them to take photos outside. Story 71. I probably wouldn't answer the door, but if I did, I would let them in if they didn't give me bad vibes. I would talk to them about the house first to ensure they were being truthful. If it was a man, I most likely wouldn't let him in though. Better to be safe than sorry. Story 72. We drive by my grandma's house when we are in the area. The new owners are very nice, but we do not need to bother them. Story 73. Well, I don't think that slamming the door in their face would be one of my choices. I'm not sure about inviting them in either. I guess it would depend on the situation. Story 74. I do not engage with strangers at my door, and that is exactly what I tell them. Then I check the back door and recheck the front to see where they are. Story 75. I wouldn't feel comfortable letting a stranger into my home. Anyone could say anything. I would not do it. Story 76. People who live in homes that are over 100 years old are much more likely to experience this, especially if they have invested considerable effort in renovating them. Story 77. If someone knocked on my door and I wasn't expecting anyone, you would need to knock several times because I am not answering. Story 78. I tell them to get lost. People have no right to homes just because they grew up there or for some other trivial reason. Get off my lawn. Story 79. The person who used to own my house came by to share this information. His sister owned the house across the street, and this was his parents' house that he inherited. We did not let him in. Story 80. When my husband and I first moved in, we were outside working in the yard when someone walking past stopped to chat. "Oh, you moved in here? The last person here died from a heroin overdose." "Okay, welcome." So no, I'm not letting anyone in, not even the ghost. Story 81. I wouldn't even open the door. But also, no, that's strange. Unless we talked and got to know each other a little bit, a stranger I know nothing about, other than they used to live in my home, is not coming in. Story 82. I wouldn't let strangers into my house. I don't take chances like that. I would probably answer the door with a firearm concealed behind my back. Do not become a target. Story 83. I wouldn't slam the door in their face, but I wouldn't invite them in either. I am an introvert and don't need to bring strangers into my house, especially since they have lived here before. It's the same house, just with new furnishings. Have a nice day. Story 84. I would know they were lying. Even if it were possible that they grew up in this house, I would not let them in. Story 85. Some friends had this happen. Someone who had been a servant to the wife's parents, with the wife having grown up in the house, came unannounced. Both were shocked to see each other after so long. They invited her to stay for the night, provided a spare room, and allowed her to take a bath. She died of natural causes in the bath. I was a late teenager at the time, and it was the first strange event I had experienced. Story 86. They are most likely not answering the door. If I heard them say that, I would respond, "That seems unlikely," since I was the first owner of my house and the land was not residential prior to construction. Story 87. All they would receive is a response of, "Oh, true, that's great. See you," followed by the door closing. What kind of person would show up at a house they grew up in and introduce themselves as if I am supposed to care? Story 88. Two elderly ladies appeared at my doorstep, both around 85 years old, and mentioned that their mother was born in this house. They asked if they could come in and look around. They recalled visiting Granny's house in the country when they were young, until Granny and Grandpa moved to the nearby small city. The main part of the house was built around 1865, with a few additions over the years, but it was extensively renovated in the 1980s, so it was unlikely they would recognize anything. I invited them in, but they did not venture much more than a few steps inside. Story 89. I will likely ask questions about the house. I have conducted some of my own research so I can formulate questions. If they meet the requirements, I would probably allow them entry. Story 90. I would schedule a tour after the next scheduled cleaning day because the space is small and well lived in. Story 91. I would ask if they are the ones who forget to flush the toilet. Then I would slam the door in their face because that smell is awful. Story 92. I am getting a flashback of a scene from the Netflix series Night Agent. An elderly woman invites a couple into her home for a particular reason, and the elderly lady ends up dead. Story 93. We experienced that situation. They acted as if they still owned the house and had an attitude as if we stole it. We asked them to leave and not return. Story 94. I went to my childhood house, and a car pulled in with a mother and two children, along with groceries. I said hello and mentioned that I grew up in the house. It was obvious she wasn't in the mood, so I expressed my hope that she loves it as much as I did and walked away. She didn't know me anything. Story 95. Yeah, that's strange. I would make some small talk but never let them in. It just means they believe they still have some ownership, even though they don't. Story 96. They could have laid the foundation with their bare hands, and I still would not even consider that. If it meant that much to you, you should not have left. My safe place, no, go away. Story 97. The thought of inviting them would never have crossed my mind. I would find it really strange if some strangers came to my door just to tell me a story about having lived here. I would talk politely with them until they left or I excused myself. Then I would call the police to report a very suspicious situation. I would assume they made up a story to see if anyone was home, probably intending to rob my place or a nearby house. Story 98. I wouldn't let them in at that moment. I would maybe schedule a time for them to come back so I could tidy up and put away anything valuable. It happened at my first house, but we knew the people we bought it from. It was kind of a mistake. They were not happy we remodeled and removed some dead trees. I guess they thought it was bad for us to rip out the 1970s gold linoleum and remove the carpets. They had beautiful hardwood floors underneath, which I refinished, and they turned out great. I installed new windows, took down the cluttered screened porch, and revamped the backyard. They were very unhappy. Story 99. My brother and sister visited our grandmother's house after she passed away, and it was sold. I chose not to go because it's their house, and I still see it as my grandmother's home where I spent countless hours helping my uncle remodel. I have many memories tied to that place. I don't want to bring those feelings into their new home. Story 100. I was visiting my childhood home. I did not expect it to be lived in, but when I saw it was occupied, I kept my distance and spoke to the homeowners without approaching the door. I did not request entry either. I just wanted to see it one last time before moving across the country. It was good I didn't see inside. I can remember it as it was. Story 101. I live in a home built in the 1830s. One time, a lady in her 60s came by with her 90-year-old mother, who used to live in the home. We showed them around and were on the main floor talking to the lady when we realized we hadn't seen her mother in a while. We went upstairs to check on her. She was standing in the hall with tears in her eyes and said she was saying goodbye to an old friend. In an obscure spot upstairs, the name Lena was hammered into the floor with very small finishing nails. So small and in such an obscure location that you would need to know it was there. It was very moving. There are other spots in the house where initials are carved as well. It is incredible to think about how many lives passed through our home. Story 102. I have done those myself and they let us in. I would definitely do the same. My house is more than 100 years old, and I am sure many people have grown up here. Story 103. I would because I was on the other side of the door. I went back to my childhood home, and the lady living there was actually the woman who bought it from my parents. It was a great reunion. Story 104. I took my wife to visit the house where I grew up. We live in Asia, and the house is on the east coast of the United States. The current homeowner came out, and we had a pleasant chat about the house, then invited us into the family room to see some of the changes they had made. It was surreal to be in a space that was so familiar yet so foreign. I really appreciate the current homeowner for allowing us to see my old place in a new light. Story 105. My mom and I stopped by a house my parents owned in the 1970s, and she pointed out a few things about it. The current resident wasn't home, but the neighbor was. He politely asked, "Can I help you with something?" Mom explained what we were doing, and the neighbor immediately asked, "Do you know why all these square holes were cut in the fence?" We have never been able to figure it out. We ended up having a lovely conversation about the history of the neighborhood, some of the former residents, and a couple of unusual quirks about the things inside. Overall, it was a pleasant experience. Before going back to her hometown for her 40th high school reunion, Mom wrote a letter to the current resident of the house where she grew up, explaining who she was and asking if it would be possible to see the house. They were very accommodating and had many questions about some of the much older features. In this case, Minnesota Nice absolutely worked in her favor. Story 106. I am a woman. You don't let strangers into your home. I was stalked by a man and had to move. I have watched too many psychological thriller movies to ever let a stranger enter my home, so I wouldn't slam the door in their face. I wouldn't have opened the door at all. Story 107. My mother was 6 months old when her father violently killed her mother and then himself. She has spent her entire life searching for belonging. As an adult, curiosity drove her to knock on the door of the home where the tragedy occurred. The homeowner was kind, allowing her to explore and stand in the same room where her parents ceased to exist. This experience aided my mother's healing journey. I am grateful to that homeowner in Batavia, New York, who offered my mother a little peace with her past and helped her obtain one more piece of the puzzle that is her origin. Story 108. I would schedule a time with them if they didn't seem untrustworthy and let them talk about the place outside first. I was fortunate to have left a time capsule in the accessible rafters of the house at a specific spot in a jar when I was 8 years old. I also left a note on the door that said, "Hi, I grew up here. I left a time capsule in this location. I would love to come see my childhood home. If you would entertain that, I would be grateful, but I understand if not. It's their home, not mine." However, they were lovely, and we had a great afternoon at their discretion, which worked out well. Short of that, I don't know how anyone could avoid looking like a scam, honestly. I was able to describe the items I left in the attic, including a child's scrawled note and some pictures of my family, our dog, and the house. I also looked like an adult version of myself, which helped. Story 109. I always thought about doing this with my childhood home. I wouldn't want to interrupt someone's day or for them to think I'm trying to rob them. Story 110. I am fascinated by history and would love to hear all about it. However, I feel embarrassed about the state of the house since I have a toddler. Story 111. No, it's too easy for that to be a setup. I'm not putting my family's safety at risk to satisfy someone's nostalgia. Story 112. Since I live in my childhood home, which was finished being built when I was 18 months old, I would slam the door after laughing in their faces, especially if it was my sister. She has a key. Story 113. I would be confused and suspicious since my house was brand new when I purchased it, and it was industrial land before that. Story 114. I would advise them to do what my parents did. Drive past and point it out to their children. Then I would close the door. Story 115. I am very socially anxious, so I do not answer the door unless I know who it is. It is reassuring to see how many other people are like me in this comment section. Story 116. I honestly don't get it. Do people really do that? As in, when they don't know the new owner at all. I'll admit I've slowly driven past my late grandmother's house a few times in the years after my dad sold it back to the city, but it would never occur to me to ask a complete stranger to let me in so I can do what? Unless they kept all the furniture and didn't change anything, it wouldn't be the same for me. My mom still lives in my childhood home, but even that has changed so much since I moved out almost 20 years ago that I'm not very emotionally attached to it. But to answer the question, if I wasn't home alone and they weren't giving me weird vibes, I'd probably let them have a quick look around. We don't really have anything worth stealing, so I'm not worried about someone casing the joint. Story 117. No way. I'm immediately reminded of the post where the daughter of the previous owner invited herself to give birth there. When refused, she came anyway with her midwife when the birth was imminent. Nostalgia is fine, but you can't go home again. It will always be different. My sister and mother did something similar at what had been our old family cottage. It had been in the family since it was built by my grandfather and was sold 10 years ago when he died. It seemed very entitled to go look at our old cottage, which is the vibe they had about it, since it is now and has been for a while someone else's cottage. I refused to go. If you need to feel in the presence of something you shared with him, it might even make you feel worse. It will be different with his belongings gone and other people's belongings there, as if history was erased. It's a bad feeling too. I hope you find some comfort. Story 118. I have a no solicitor sign on my door. If you knock and I'm not expecting you, you will receive the same treatment that the sign indicates. I don't care if we made eye contact through the window. You will be ignored. Story 119. That's strange. I wouldn't disturb random people by invading their privacy. There's no way it would be acceptable for me to go to someone's house and claim that I grew up there. My response would be something like, "That's an interesting story," and then I would close the door. Story 120. Anyone seen the Jennifer Lopez video of her visiting her childhood home? The new owner didn't know who she was and did not invite her in. Story 121. I was on my porch when a man came down the road and said he grew up in the neighborhood. He mentioned he lived across the street and that his friend lived in my house. I asked him a question about my house and he knew the answer. The conversation was enjoyable. Did I invite him in? No, that was not going to happen. Story 122. Sounds like a good way to get harmed in your own home, to be honest. Get away from my home, you strange individuals. Next time you knock, I will be forced to take action. Hypothetically, of course. Story 123. I have no idea who you are, and it's my house. I don't care if you lived here as a child. Story 124. No. This is my house. Please go away. If I see them again after I told them no, I will call the police and self-defense if necessary. The furniture is all different. It's incredibly foolish to want to enter a house you used to live in when it looks nothing like it did before. You can see the outside, which probably looks the same. That's enough. I do not want strangers in my house looking at and possibly stealing my belongings. Story 125. Why are these the only options? Probably neither, politely, but a no. It's possible I would let them in, but it is very dependent on their attitude and how I am feeling. Story 126. I would ask who they know in the neighborhood and call those people if it checks out and my husband is home. Then maybe. Otherwise, no. I understand. My house is from 1812. Many people here have lived in the area all their lives, as have their parents and grandparents before them. I understand the appeal, but you never know, so trust but verify. Story 127. My husband had this house built and toured the empty lot. So if someone claims they lived here, they would have to be a ghost who occupied vacant land. I wouldn't slam the door in their face right away. First, I would need a good laugh at their expense. Story 128. I would invite them in if they could provide me with information about themselves. I know the last name and details about the only other family to ever live in this house. Story 129. My family has lived here for 52 years and are close to the family that lived here for 60 years before that, so they must be quite old. Story 130. I have always wanted to do this, especially since the interior of my house from the 1980s has changed so much. Story 131. My parents are the original owners of the house I grew up in, and I am currently living there. Therefore, the stranger would also be an untrustworthy liar. Story 132. I am the sole owner of a new construction. I would politely tell them to leave and close the door. However, I probably would not answer the door anyway. Story 133. I worked with someone who grew up in the house I am in now, so I would invite him for a drink. His family bought the house when it was new, so there would not be anyone else outside of his family who would be applicable in this scenario. Story 134. I would talk with them, and if their story seems legitimate, such as the history of the house and knowledge of the layout, I would probably invite them in to see it again. Story 135. I know who has lived in this place for the last 100 years, and they are not them. The people on my doorstep better be running, is all I can say. Story 136. Well, I know them, so I would let them in before they even said anything. There was another house here before this one was built, so if they showed up, it really depends on whether they seem normal or not. If they appear normal enough, sure. Story 137. My family is the only one who has occupied the house I live in, so if someone said otherwise, I would know they were lying to me. I wouldn't invite them in and would ask them to leave. Story 138. I live less than a mile from where I grew up. I suppose if I really wanted to, I could copy some family home videos onto my phone to prove that my story is legitimate. Story 139. Slam the door in the zombie's face. My house was old, built in the 1860s, and my parents had it for a while, so anyone who lived there would be dead or very old. Story 140. At our first house, we were visited by an elderly lady who grew up there. She brought a tapestry crochet of the house based on a picture she had. When we sold the house, we left the tapestry behind along with a note about its origin pinned to it. Story 141. Why are those the only two options? You haven't even said that they are asking to come in. I would probably chat with them for a moment. I also know both couples that owned the house. The previous owners had no children and are in a retirement home, while the current owners have very young children. I guess I would keep them talking so I could submit the footage to the neighborhood group or the police. Story 142. Slam the door. This land and this house have been in my family for generations. If you are both alive and I do not know you, then you have never lived here. Story 143. I know all the former owners of my property. One of them is my pharmacist. If they told me who they were related to, I would probably let them take a look. Story 144. I have done this myself, but I wrote to the people and organized it beforehand. It was a house my relatives owned when I was a child, and we sold it when that relative died. I was about 10. The house had not been well maintained due to old age, so we sold it as is. 40 years later, I felt like seeing it again, so I wrote to the current occupants with a letter, as I only knew the address and didn't know who they were. They emailed me and we met up. They were not the people we sold to, but the second set of owners. They had renovated the house beautifully, modernizing it while preserving all the old period features. They were interested to hear some of the house's history. Seeing it again, especially so loved and well cared for, really helped me say goodbye in a way. It was a great experience. Story 145. I would tell them to leave, get their license plate, take a picture from my security camera of them and their car, and file a police report. I had the house built. No one else has lived here. Story 146. I couldn't. My friend lives in a large historical home reputed to be haunted. Many times, she has had people come wanting a tour, even once on Christmas. Initially, she did give tours, but over time she learned not to do that. Story 147. I would tell them we built this house ourselves and have been the only family to ever live here. Good day. Story 148. This has happened to me and I would do neither. I told them they were welcome to take pictures in the yard in front of the house, but no one could come in. Story 149. My house was built in 2012 on land that had been a woodlot for the previous 300 years. I would love to hear their story, but they are telling it from the porch. Story 150. I had a boss over 20 years ago who, when back in his hometown, used to visit a house he had previously lived in to see how a crazy paved patio he laid was doing. He did this multiple times and was genuinely invested in it. He was that kind of person with no boundaries or self-awareness, and thought this was a normal and acceptable thing to do. Story 151. I wanted to do this but was told not to because I might get shot. However, I always wanted to see one of my favorite houses from my childhood. To answer the actual question, yes, I would let them in and hope they weren't dangerous. I think it's nice to let them see their childhood home. Story 152. My favorite story about my grandpa is when my family took a trip to Vermont where he grew up. He looked at a house he used to live in and was invited inside. My mom, stepdad, brother, grandma, and grandpa accepted the invitation. They sat around the kitchen table talking for about an hour. At one point, my grandpa stood up, thanked them for their hospitality, and said his goodbyes. After everyone got into the car, my grandpa said, "That was the wrong house." Story 153. Yes, their names and heights at various ages were still visible in the doorframe of a bedroom closet. Story 154. I saw a few comments suggesting that a letter may be a better icebreaker, and I agree. It is much less creepy and intimidating than showing up on their doorstep. I'm very sorry to hear that you lost your dad recently. Story 155. My parents moved into my childhood home before I was born, and I lived there until I moved out on my own at age 22. They moved away about 18 years ago. The couple who bought the house from my parents still lives there. I keep in touch with a former neighbor across the street. The last time I visited home, my old neighbor introduced us to the new owners. They allowed us to come inside and see some of the changes they made to the house. It looks completely different, but in a good way. It was nice to see. However, I would never have knocked on their door and expected them to let me in. Story 156. Why the extremes? Good Lord. I wouldn't let them in because it's like, so what, why does that matter? But I also wouldn't slam the door in their face. Story 157. I would tell them they must be confused because my family had this house built, and we are the only ones who have lived in it. Story 158. I watched my house being built and was one of the original residents. If I had bothered to answer the door, I would have just closed it. Story 159. I knew a woman who took wedding pictures both outside and inside her childhood home, which a different family had been living in for years. Her husband was not from the town and had no connection to that house. Seems strange all around. Why would he want pictures in a location that holds no meaning for him? Why would she request wedding pictures in a house where she never lived while dating him? Additionally, it seems unusual to knock on the door and make such a request. It is just a peculiar situation overall. Story 160. I would ask them their name. I have conducted my own title research and know the last two owners by their last names. My aunt did this once in the house where she and my dad grew up. My grandparents sold it to another family, and their son turned out to be the lead singer of a band with multiple platinum albums. Story 161. It depends on the time of day and the situation, but if they seemed legitimate, I would absolutely let them in. If they appeared suspicious, I'm sorry, but those memories are all you get. Story 162. I watched a show about William Shatner, where he explained his upbringing and early days as an actor. They drove to his old apartment in Montreal, and he knocked on the door, telling them he used to live there. However, it felt different because it was Shatner, not just someone random. The person living in his old apartment let them in. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.